Hello everybody and welcome back to another Hellbound Garage. I am sorry that I left you with the cliffhanger that I did in the last video. Full disclosure, that cranking over while it's been sitting in the garage was actually after like 8 hours worth of diag in my driveway because I was thinking I was going to get it started and it just didn't start. So I spent 8 hours in the driveway thinking I was going to be able to get it cranked over and started, and that didn't happen. And my timing light was dull enough, even though it's brand new, that I couldn't see in the middle of the daylight and I had other things going on. So I just didn't get around to finishing the diag at that point. I'm sorry about the fan in the background, by the way. That being said, I pushed it into the garage, and later that night I kept trying to do diag on it, but I actually killed the brand new battery in the car and had to go throw it on the charger. And yeah, it's been a lot of stuff going on, but because I've done so much diag, you may be watching this just to try and understand something about Megasquirt and the DIY auto-tune program, and I just want to share some experiences of mine before we continue on getting this thing going, because I've done a bunch of diag at this point and I think I've got everything narrowed down, so I'm getting really close. So before I button everything back up, I figured it'd be a great time to show you everything that I've been doing and just kind of how you can troubleshoot your stuff if things aren't working out. Alright, so the first thing on here that I actually ended up having a problem with was the crank position sensor. This thing caused me all kinds of problems. So after you get your preliminary stuff into the computer and you've got it hooked up to your car, you're going to turn the vehicle on and you're going to go through a couple of calibrations first. You've got your calibrate your TPMS, calibrate map, and calibrate your AFR depending on if you're depending on the oxygen sensor or the wideband that you're running with the car. Pretty standard stuff. After that, the next thing I believe that the Mega Manual actually tells you to do is to open this thing called the Diagnostic and High Speed Logger, and to go to the logger type and do a composite logger. Now what this does is it shows that your crank trigger is actually reading, and it's reading the teeth that are missing. This is like the number one thing you want to do before you ever start the car. Quite honestly, I think that this may have been the problem with my first setup when this car originally had the L28, but at this point I'll never know because that was like 6 years ago. But you open up the composite logger, you can go ahead and click the capture to log file, and that will save whatever populates here into a file that you can look at to make sure nothing is wonky, as well as you can share it with others if you can find somebody that can help you if you're having that many problems. After you do that, then you can click this start button and you'll crank the engine over for like 10 to 20 seconds, I think is what the Mega Manual says, and it will show a graph on here. I'm not going to show you on here because I've already done it, but it'll have this bar graph with a dip every so often, and that shows each one of those bars is the teeth, and then the dip is the one missing tooth, because on my setup and most of the setups running this, you're running a 36 to 1 trigger wheel, and that one is the dip in this. That means that the crank has done a full rotation and that this is registering now. If this doesn't register, that's your first problem. Now for me, that was the very first thing that I had an issue with. You'll have to excuse the state that this engine bay is in right now. It is torn apart because I've been double checking everything after the 8 hours of diag yesterday and not getting this thing started. So the very first thing that was a problem was my crank sensor. And if you can see this little jumper here, this is, I think they call it a resistor or pull-up resistor. It's supplied with this sensor from DIY, and depending on your setup, you may or may not need that resistor. Depends on the version of the Megasquirt that you get. And that, I think, don't quote me on this, it technically pulls up the voltage so things are easier to read. In newer versions of the MS3, I guess they have made it so you don't need that anymore. I'm guessing because I bought this thing a couple of years ago, that's the whole reason mine didn't have it. I thought it did, and that caused me all kinds of problems because I wasn't getting a crank sensor. So right now it's just rigged in there, but it's working. I put the resistor in there and now it shows the signal. Now I'm having an issue with my cam sensor, and I think it may be the same problem, but because I can get the car started without the cam sensor, for now I'm going to leave that and get the car set up on a dumber system, and then go back and get the rest of it working the way it should be. Alright, so after you have the composite logger going and you have that file saved and everything looks good, they then tell you to go through and go to the tooth logger and do that same kind of deal. Run the car for 10-20 seconds and look at the log to see if there's anything goofy. There will be spikes in it. I think they said if it's got 2 spikes instead of 1, that's where the problem actually lies, because that registers 2 teeth, I think. Don't quote me on that. But this is another way of also making sure that you have crank signal. Now the composite logger, I did forget to mention, will also show the cam sensor, and that's why I think I may have a problem, because I have bars for the first part of it, and then as we continue it kind of drops off. I'm not sure if that's just a setting in here until the car starts up. Not really sure at this point. As long as I can get the car started, I'm not going to worry about it till afterwards. Alright, so I forgot to mention this off the bat. Very first thing, when you're doing all this diagnostic work, make sure the fuses are pulled for your coils and your injectors and your fuel pump. You don't want anything going off that you don't need going off at this point. If you do have things going off when they're not supposed to be, you could have some issues. So make sure you pull your fuses. It says it in bold letters in the Mega Manual. I'm going to say it here to save my butt. Make sure you pull the fuses when you're not diagnosing that particular part of the vehicle. That being said, after you've made sure that you have your crank signal, you can then go into a couple of different things from here. For me personally, I kind of did this backwards. If you watch the Jim Stim video, then you know that in this test mode, I went down to the output test mode, and from this menu, I bench tested to make sure that all the outputs on the MS3 were working correctly. Now, because of all the diag problems that I have had dealing with all this, I went back into this mode, and I've actually pulled the fuel rails and I've pulled the spark plug wires off of the vehicle. That is because I went through and I enabled the test mode here, and then do either coils or injectors. Don't do both at the same time, but I went through, I did the injector testing first, and I did the injector testing mode 1, and then for each of the 8 injectors, I did 1 bank at a time. I went through and I made sure that the injectors were firing. That way I knew for a fact that fuel was getting in the cylinders. Wear PPE, whatever you gotta do, be safe while you're doing this. I currently have fuel inside the valley of my engine that I probably shouldn't have done some of the tests that I have been doing with that fuel there. but don't do what I do as I say. So I went through and I watched each injector, made sure that they were pulsing, firing, and that everything was good from there. Now, after doing the injector testing, this is where I went and did the coil testing. Now, coil testing, especially on things like a coil near plug, like an LS, is a little different than your distributor or whatnot, at least in my opinion. So what I ended up doing, you probably use this for just about any spark plug test, even if it's not on an aftermarket ECU. You can pull the spark plug wires, and I'll show you what I got set up. This is what I have set up. So I've got my coil plugged into one of my spark plugs, and then I have that spark plug grounded, in this case using a jumper cable to the strut tower. That way this is grounded and you don't get shocked, but you can still see that it's got spark. And then from there we can go into this deal here, into the coil testing, and individually check each coil based on where they're positioned. As far as I know, if you have anything besides a blue spark, if it may be red, yellow, whatever, then you have a weak spark. But as long as you have blue spark, your stuff should be good. Don't quote me on that. Once again, this is just kind of by what I'm reading. So at this point, I have now checked the crank sensor, so I know I've got signal there. I know I have spark at every cylinder, and I know I have fuel at every cylinder. The next thing on the list is going to be making sure that your engine and your timing are at top dead center or before top dead center. This is honestly where I have struggled the most on this, because of how my setup is and where my sensor is compared to where it's bolted on the wheel and where top dead center is on the actual engine. Not gonna sure if I'm gonna be able to actually show you anything. I'll try. It's kind of goofy, because when it's at top dead center, the mark is on the balancer, it comes kind of in at maybe like a 10-degree angle. The sensor is at like an 80-degree angle from top dead center, and then the missing tooth that actually times this engine based on the computer is in between both of them, and that's not typically how you want your deal all the way around. But because it's all electronic, it's relatively easy to get that all lined up as long as you know what you're doing. Alright, so now please always refer to the Mega Manual when doing this. I don't care about YouTube videos. YouTube videos are a good reference, but the Mega Manual is kind of your go-to. Now for the timing on this vehicle, to get it set up before you do anything else, once again, this is laid out in the Mega Manual. You've got your trigger wheel options here in the ignition wheel decoder. Hopefully you've got most of this information already filled out. The one that is the one that we're going to be focusing on is this tooth number 1 angle, degrees before top dead center. First thing you want to do before you try and figure out the timing on this is make sure that your advance is fixed timing and that you have that set to 0 degrees. You want absolutely no reason for the computer to put timing into this while you're trying to figure out timing before top dead center. Kind of defeats the purpose of it. Now, I strongly recommend that while you're doing this, you are in your garage with the garage door closed where it's darker, because timing lights, it doesn't matter. I've used a few of them on different vehicles. I have never had great luck outside with a timing light. It's just too bright unless you're in the middle of the night, and then, well, you're probably making your neighbors mad depending on where you're living. So that's where I struggled yesterday. So I pulled the car back into the garage, and I have this guy right here. This guy right here, we'll go into this in a minute. hooked up to the car, and then what you're looking for is you're looking for this angle before top dead center. Now if you look at mine, because of how my stuff is laid out, I have a very, very weird number in this degree. Mine's 297 degrees. Yesterday, between the fickleness of this timing light and not being able to see it in the bright outside, I had this number absolutely everywhere, and I've actually tried to start the car without this number being correct. Let me tell you, it don't work. So make sure you figure out this number before anything else. Now a little more on this guy. This guy is from Harbor Freight, and for my purpose and reading LS coils and using Megasquirt, this works. And this thing has a dial on it and everything else. It's not like a super uber cheap generic, even though it is. But this thing works good as long as you got that set to 0. Now, the problem that came into play with this was actually dealing with this clamp here. This right here is how I had this set up for probably 10 hours. Right like that, on cylinder 1. And this is how I was trying to get my timing going. You take the gun, you point it towards the light, and it's supposed to register every time spark goes through that wire. The issue with that is that if you look at this clamp inside there, you'll see that it's got metal, right? Now that's what registers the spark within the wire. So with my clamp being the way that it was, I think the problem was this metal wasn't resting enough against the spark plug wire to register every time that spark went through. So I was getting very intermittent flashes with the timing light, and I had no idea what was causing it. I didn't know if it was an ECU problem, a coil problem, didn't know. But for S&Gs, I flipped this around so that more pressure was put onto this, and lo and behold, it worked perfectly. And after that problem was solved, it took me like 10 minutes to figure out exactly where my timing marks needed to be based on everything that's going on. Moral of the story, if you're having intermittent flashes with your timing light, flip the clamp and see if that solves the problem. So that kind of catches you up to what's been going on and why the car didn't start, at least I think. Now I have to bolt down the fuel rails. I've got a couple of fuel leaks at the rails that I didn't know about until I put pressure to them. So I do have to fix those, as well as get all of the coils hooked back up. So after that's all done, I will check back in with you, and maybe I can get this thing started now.
A little later.
Here goes everything and nothing. I don't know. I got a fire extinguisher on standby. We'll see what happens. Alright, time to get you guys caught up. There has been a lot of diagnosing going on with the car. The biggest thing is actually the wiring. Let me show you what I mean. So if you're a wiring person, I apologize for the travesty that is happening in this engine bay at this point, because if you'll notice right there and there, probably over there, there is all kinds of splices and cheap splices going on in this wiring harness at this point, and I've got all kinds of wiring going back and forth, and that's for one simple reason. Like many before me, I fell under the misconception that wiring the injectors and the coils for the engine You can do 1, 2, 3, 4. You match it up with A, B, C, D, and then change the settings in Megasquirt or in Tuner Studio to tell the ECU how you want it to fire each one of those cylinders, injectors, and coils. And that's not the case with Megasquirt. With Megasquirt, you still have to wire the car up for the correct firing sequence of the engine. So in the case of a small block, 1, 8, 4, 3, 6, 5, 7, 2. And well, I had it wired as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And yeah, that causes a major problem. Now, in switching the wiring for the injectors and coils on this, it doesn't seem like that big of a deal, right? Because if you come over here, and I had to write this down before it like sunk in, you know, you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and these crossed out ones are the ones that are pretty easy to switch over. So 1 was already wired correctly, 2 and 8 were a simple switch, and then 7 was also correct. So cylinders 3 through 6 needed to be rewired. Now, that on paper, that doesn't seem like a big of an issue, but if you think about it, cylinder 3, cylinder 4, cylinder 5, cylinder 6. So I had to take all the splicing from here and extend it over to here, and vice versa back over here. So I had to do that with for 4 injectors and 4 coils. Now, it doesn't seem very difficult, but the coil packs on these are smart coils or LS coils, so they have 4 wires per coil. So you have 16 wires that you have to cut and extend, and then you have 8 wires that you have to cut and extend for the injectors. And that takes a lot of extra wire, a lot of crimping, and a lot of time. And now my once organized wiring harness that I spent quite a bit of time on laying out is now a giant rat's nest. Now, going along with my wiring problems, the cam sensor or the Vortec distributor, now that I figured that out, there wasn't originally any kind of layout on DIY Auto Tune about how to wire this up to the MS3X. They now offer this part through their website, but originally I had to buy it from EFI Connection, and their documentation on how to wire it wasn't all that great, so I had to find documentation online, and come to find out I had 2 of the wires flip-flopped. DIY AutoTune now has a document on how to wire that in, so I got that fixed. So those have been the 2 big problems that I've run into up until this point. So now I'm going to push the car back out into the driveway and crank it over and see if this thing fires. Yes! Yes! I cannot believe that was a fucking problem. Are you kidding me? Yes! I did it. The Datsun finally runs. Hallelujah.
Now, since the last clip, I have rolled the car all the way out to the edge of my driveway just to make sure while it was running, if something bad happened and it started on fire or whatnot, that it was away from both my house and garage. Nothing like that obviously happened. You will notice though that the air cleaner is off of it, as well as one of the valve covers, and that's because I've already started doing some checks you're supposed to do while the engine is warm, and everything looks good. Now I'm gonna put myself on blast on this one, and I had 2 more issues after my last explanation of things that I had wrong with the fuel injection setup, and the main thing pertains to that guy right there, the cam sensor. So the cam sensor, because this is a Vortec distributor style cam sensor, I don't know a lot about these distributors. I know enough about to make an engine run and make it run decent, but you can't use the same logic with the Vortec distributor, especially when you buy one from EFI Connections, or maybe DIY Auto Tunes now has it because they have that silver cap on top. That silver cap hides what they call a reluctor wheel. Now, if you ran just a standard Vortec distributor, on top of the reluctor wheel is the rotor that spins and then hits the inside of the cap and sends signal to each individual cylinder. Well, when you buy them from DIY AutoTune or EFI Connections, the rotor that is normally bolted to the reluctor wheel isn't there. And I had no idea what I was looking at. No idea how to time it because it didn't have the rotor on there for me to use as reference for cylinder 1. So I think I've now switched that around 4 or 5 times to finally get the correct wiring. And once again, I ended up having to extend the wiring for that part of the harness because the connection is actually way farther away from it than what I originally had wired. So another thing I get to fix on the next wiring harness. But the single most dumb thing that at some point happened through all of this, that is probably the main reason that the car didn't start, because a car that's timed bad is still going to start. A car that has enough fuel and is timed bad is still going to start, especially with this software, as long as everything's set up. But there is one way that will not happen, and that is in this setting right here on Tuner Studio. Now, what I ended up doing at some point, because I was trying to figure out all kinds of things with this setup, because obviously there's quite a few things wrong, at some point in here, I not only had the injectors wrong, this guy here, I found out that I was sold different injectors than what I thought they were. So, but at this point, it's way too long ago for me to say anything about it. So I fixed that. But this guy right here, engine displacement. So I blindly put in 358. 358 is the cubic inches of my small block Chevy because it's been bored 40 over. Now, that would be perfectly fine had this right here been clicked. So that would be cubic inch displacement. The problem is, at some point, this got clicked, cc's. So I was trying to make a 5,867 cc engine run off of 358 cc's worth of fuel. Yeah. This right here was an aha moment during one of my breaks at work. I have been going through all the settings, checking everything, and then I stumbled upon this little issue right here. And as soon as that happened, I'm like, oh my gosh, I think I solved everything. And well, it solved it. I feel really, really stupid because of that. And I know for a fact that when I got the initial setup into the ECU, that was not the case. It was 358 cubic inches, not cc's. I don't know when it happened, but with all the other issues, regardless of the cc's, it wouldn't have started. But after fixing all the problems, and then that being a setting in Tuner Studio, that was kind of what was the last day's worth of work. So yeah. Anywho, I have taken a couple of data logs while I had the vehicle out in the driveway. I let it kind of get up to temperature around 160-ish degrees, which I know is not all the way there, but it's close enough for my purposes. So I'm going to look through that and make adjustments to the tune based on that, because it's definitely running rich right now. But a couple of other things before I continue messing with the motor, now that I know it runs the way it's supposed to. I have a couple of little things I need to button up. The exhaust, I cut that hanger, so now the exhaust is a little funky. And of course, if you heard that video, this engine sounds nothing like it used to. 5 years ago, this is completely different. This thing is loud, which it was loud before, but not that loud. So I think I'm gonna have to look at an exhaust system, and that might not be right off the bat because a custom exhaust can get kind of expensive. But I will at least fix the hanger so it's not dangling on the ground. I have to build a bracket for the clutch line, because if you look down here, you can see where it naturally rests, and that is directly against the exhaust. I also have to, because race car of all things, the box down there that is for the half cage, roll bar, whatever you want to call it, that actually covers the spot for factory seatbelt. So even if I had a working seatbelt, which this car really didn't have to begin with, I couldn't put it where it's supposed to go. So I have to find a harness for this car, something that's going to be relatively easy for street use. I do know that there are a couple of DOT approved harnesses. DOT approved harnesses are a little spendy, but safety is definitely a concern. I'm already going to be a giant walking target when this car is on the road. I don't need any other stupid reason for law enforcement to do anything to my car. And then the very final thing, which is probably the most important thing, is I actually need to get to this vehicle registered in the state that I live in. The last time that I registered this vehicle, it was in a different state, so I gotta get plates and change my insurance, because I do have insurance for the Datsun in case something happens to the garage or whatever else, but I do not have full coverage insurance for the road, so I gotta get that done too. Still a few things to finish before I can legally test drive this thing on the road, but this is super exciting. Like I said, I haven't heard this car in 5 years. I have not put it in gear yet, but that'll be for another day, and you'll see it here. So thank you for watching. Thank you for your support. Until the next one.